Hello and welcome to the Case For, a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire Russell Christian. I'm just going to address the elephant in the room right now. You probably noticed, hey, this sounds a little bit different. I apologize. I am in between computers right now. I ordered a new computer on Black Friday, got a great deal. It hasn't arrived yet, and I'm with an old computer now. I don't have my software downloaded that I usually have, so I can't do my fancy intro music, and I'm not going to be able to edit it. So I apologize in advance. I'm recording this live. As Bill O'Reilly says, we're doing it live. I'm not going to be able to edit out the coughs and all that kind of stuff. So I apologize if it sounds rough. It's a live recording. It's going to be like my Springsteen, Nebraska, or my Dylan basement tapes here. It's just going to be a rough recording, but we're going to dispense with some of the pleasantries and some of the little jokes and whatnot, and we're just going to get right into it because we have a loaded episode right now because we're going to talk about this era committee ballot that's coming up, this vote tomorrow, the classic baseball era ballot. First, I want to do a superfan shout out. I want to throw my first superfan shout out to a Blue Sky user. Yes, I have an account over there as well. A user, Louisville Slugger at bsky.social. Slugger, as I call this person, and I have had some good conversations over at Blue Sky. And one in particular, which is pertinent for this episode, about prioritizing living players into the Hall of Fame, which is a fitting conversation for this, our 19th episode, in which I'm going to be breaking down the classic baseball era ballot, which is comprised of some players who are still living and some who have passed on. This ballot's a good one. I think by far this is the most stacked era committee ballot I've ever seen, or at least I remember in recent history. Every single player on this ballot has had an incredible career and has a very strong Hall of Fame case. And three of these players, Dave Parker, Tommy John, and Steve Garvey, are three of the players that inspired me to create this podcast. So this is an awesome ballot. It's a really important episode for which I don't have my proper software, so I apologize. I can't make my voice sound pretty with compression and whatnot. Once the new computer comes in, it's going to sound better than ever. I work really hard to make this sound professional for you guys, so apologize. This is sort of a rough recording, but hey, we're having fun. It's the holidays. We're going to make do. So there's so much to talk about, so without further ado, let's just get right into it here. The classic baseball era ballot vote is going to be tomorrow, Sunday. That's December 8th. As you may or may not know, there's essentially two paths to enshrinement into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. The first is to be voted in by the Baseball Writers Association of America. This is the most popular and the most common method. It's for recently retired players, and briefly the qualifications are that you have to be retired at least 5 years. You get 10 years to be on the ballot, and you have to get at least 75% of the votes. But if at any point during the 10 years you get a vote percentage of 5 or less, you're off the ballot. So it's not the end of your Hall of Fame chances, but a candidate kind of falls into baseball's equivalent of the void. If you've ever seen the Marvel show Loki, or the most recent, Deadpool vs. Wolverine movie, you know what the void is. If not, it's basically a comic book version of purgatory. So for baseball purposes, once you're off the baseball writers ballot, you can still get voted into the Hall of Fame, but the process is just a lot more complicated and can take a lot longer. A player's fate is determined by what's called the Era Committee, formerly known as the Veterans Committee. You've probably heard me use these terms, and a lot of people use them interchangeably, even though technically it's era committees now. I say Veterans Committee just because I've been doing this for a long time, so you can use the terms interchangeably. I'll know what you're talking about. According to the Baseball Hall of Fame website, the era committees, or the Veterans Committee, have elected 181 individuals to the Hall of Fame, 115 former players, 33 executives, 23 managers, and 10 umpires. This year, the Classic Baseball Era Committee will be meeting tomorrow, and their time period consists of the period prior to 1980, and including the Negro Leagues and players before the Negro Leagues. It's a stacked ballot containing the following former players: Dick Allen, Ken Boyer, John Donaldson, Steve Garvey, Vic Harris, Tommy John, Dave Parker, and Louis Tiant. Now, if you're a fan and a frequent listener of this podcast, then you know I've already covered episodes for the cases on Dave Parker, Dick Allen, Tommy John, and Louis Tiant on their own separate episodes this season. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, you definitely want to go back and give them a listen, as I'm not going to be doing repeat biographies just for the sake of time. So for today's sake, we got a lot to get into. I'm going to give my lightning round biographies and my three-part analysis, the stats, hardware, the fame factor for these remaining players I haven't already discussed, and that's Ken Boyer, John Donaldson, Steve Garvey, and Vic Harris. We're going to start with Ken Boyer. I'm going alphabetically here. There's no rhyme or reason here. Just going alphabetically. We're going to start with Ken Boyer. Ken Boyer played 15 years in Major League Baseball, most notably 11 of them with the St. Louis Cardinals. He was one of 14 kids, and him and his 6 brothers all played professional baseball, with 2 of his brothers, Cloyd and Cleet, also making the Major League. So I thought that was pretty cool. And wow, 14 kids. I really hope that all 14 of those kids gave their mom a really nice Mother's Day gift every year, because 14 kids, wow. Just like 2023 Hall of Fame inductee Scott Rowland, Boyer played third base for the Cardinals for the majority of his career, with exceptions of games early in his career in the outfield, and then towards the end of his career at first base. Before the designated hitter, first base was kind of where they put the older players out to pasture. Anyway, that is what it is. The bulk of his career was at third base, and for our purposes today, I'm going to look at his stats as kind of compared to other third basemen. I'm going to compare him a lot to Scott Rowland, because he's another Cardinal that played third base, and he got in the Hall of Fame recently. So, Ken Boyer, just look at his counting stats. Retired with very respectable counting stats. 2,143 hits, 1,104 runs, 318 doubles, 282 home runs, 1,141 RBI, 105 stolen bases, 3,443 total bases, to go along with a career slash line of 287, 349 on base, 462 slugging with an 810 OPS. So right off the bat, Boyer's career stats, although very good, don't necessarily jump off the paper for me and scream Hall of Famer. And he doesn't hit any of the Hall of Fame milestones like 3,000 hits, 500 home runs. And if you look at his individual seasons as well, he only, as I say, air quotes, only, had one season in which he hit 30 or more home runs. And that was in 1960 when he had a career high of 32 home runs. Likewise, he had, air quotes, only 2 seasons with 100 or more RBI, 1963 and 1964, when he actually led all of Major League Baseball with 119 RBI. It was actually the only time Boyer ever led the league in any offensive category, apart from 1955, when he led Major League Baseball in caught stealing with 17, which doesn't help his Hall of Fame case. So it's worth noting that, including those 32 home runs in 1960, Boyer had 8 seasons of 20 or more home runs and 8 seasons of 90 or more RBI. He also had 8 seasons of 85 or more runs, including 3 seasons with 100 or more runs. Excuse me. We're doing this live, sorry. Gotta drink some water. Excuse me. So while Boyer wasn't putting up gaudy numbers, he was consistently putting up very good offensive numbers. So you probably noticed a pattern here in what I just read off, and that's that Boyer basically had 8 good seasons. At least 8 good in terms of Hall of Fame worthy seasons. His other seasons were still respectable, but not remarkable. I'll just go ahead and say that based on counting stats, I don't see Boyer as a Hall of Famer. For this reason, I'm just going to go straight into the advanced statistics, and I'll start with one that's been getting a lot of press lately on my episodes, and one that's kind of a good fit for Boyer, who had kind of an 8-year peak, and that's JAWS, which, as you recall, takes into account a player's 7 best seasons. So it seems like an ideal fit for this player. Boyer's JAWS score is 54.5, which is fairly good considering, as I mentioned before, players with a JAWS of 60 or better have more than an 80% chance of being enshrined into the Hall of Fame, and therefore are considered likely candidates. Whereas players with a JAWS between 40 and 60 are uncertain candidates, according to Sabres. So 60 is that sweet spot. So he's just south of that magic 60 JAWS mark, which is good, but not an automatic ticket into Cooperstown. It's worth noting that according to Jay Jaffe's JAWS scale, Boyer ranks 14th, all-time in JAWS among third basemen, with all but one of the third basemen ranked higher than Boyer in the Hall of Fame. The only one not is Greg Nettles, who has a higher third baseman JAWS than Boyer, is not in the Hall of Fame, and no disrespect to Greg Nettles, he's a very good player, but I don't think a Hall of Famer. So I don't think this necessarily helps Boyer. Likewise, none of the 10 players ranked between 15th and 25th all-time and third baseman JAWS are in the Hall of Fame either, but to be fair, there's some current players in there, including Nolan Arenado, who's an outstanding third baseman, and I think building himself a nice Hall of Fame-worthy resume. So, interestingly, Boyer's ballot mate Dick Allen ranked 17th all-time for third baseman JAWS. So this JAWS score for Boyer is good, but in my opinion, doesn't really move the needle of his Hall of Fame case in my mind. Now, what about WAR? Everybody likes to talk about WAR, wins above replacement. Now, Ken has a very good career WAR. In fact, this might be one of his biggest arguments. He has a very good career WAR of 62.8. So even though he didn't hit the counting stats, got a very good career WAR. Thanks in part to a strong defense. This is, of course, one of my favorite parts of the podcast here, where I get to discuss fielding statistics. We're going to do it with Boyer and with Garvey. Can't wait to get into this. Without going too far down the rabbit hole, Boyer was a very good fielding third baseman. He led all of Major League Baseball in putouts in 1958. He twice led the league in assists and led the league in double plays turned as a third baseman 5 times. He also had 3 seasons in which he led the league in total zone, total fielding runs above average. So he was a very good fielding third baseman, which certainly helped his WAR score, which is just under the 70 to 75 sweet spot you want to be in for WAR, but higher than a lot of other Hall of Famers. He's actually tied with Hall of Famers Home Run Baker, Jesse the Crab Burkett, great nicknames, and the current player Paul Goldschmidt for 108th all-time in WAR. Very importantly, in my humble opinion, he ranks below fellow Cardinals third baseman and Hall of Famer Scott Rowland in WAR. Well, Rowland has a career WAR of 70.1, so a very good career WAR, and that 70 to 75 is a sweet spot. And that's one of the reasons I think he got in the Hall of Fame. So, in fact, when you compare Boyer to other third basemen, he ranks below non-Hall of Famers Buddy Bell and Greg Nettles in WAR. Two good players, but all due respect, and in my opinion, not Hall of Famers. And many of the third basemen who rank behind Boyer in career WAR are not in the Hall of Fame. So the WAR is very good, but again, to me, you can disagree. I don't think it moves the needle for me. What about hardware? We talked about Boyer's fantastic fielding. It was good enough to earn him 5 Gold Gloves. It's very good, but not as many as Rowland's 8 Gold Gloves. Now, the one piece of hardware that jumps out to me is Boyer's 11 All-Star selections, which is certainly impressive. But there's a caveat here. To be fair, Boyer played during a time when the All-Star game was played twice a year. So all of Boyer's 11 All-Star selections occurred in 7 seasons. So not to take anything away, 11 All-Stars is great, but basically those 11 All-Stars were spread into 7 seasons, which reinforces the critique I had of him before. That's basically that he had 8 good seasons, of which 7 he made the All-Star team. So luckily for Boyer, one of the seasons was so good that it gave Boyer his best hardware argument. That, of course, is his 1964 MVP award. That season, Boyer hit .295 with 100 runs, 24 home runs, and the aforementioned league-leading 119 RBI. More importantly, perhaps, he was seen as the team leader of a St. Louis Cardinals team that would go on to defeat the Yankees in the World Series that season. Although Boyer only batted .222 in the World Series, he did have 6 hits, including 2 home runs and 6 RBI in 7 games. So certainly was a factor. And by today's standards, where batting average isn't highly regarded, the 3 true outcomes is sort of the name of the game. I think it would have been seen as a successful World Series for Boyer. So Boyer would go on to finish his career in 1968 and 69 with the LA Dodgers. And after baseball, he became a manager in the Cardinals minor league system and eventually worked his way up to become manager of the Cardinals, but only for 3 seasons. He'd be fired in 1980 and replaced by Whitey Herzog. And while this wasn't a good move for Boyer, ultimately, of course, it was good for the Cardinals. If you know anything about Cardinals in the 80s, man, I love the Cardinals in the 80s. They played Whitey ball. It was all about speed. Man, I'm so glad people are stealing bases again in baseball. Even though the bases are bigger, it was the impetus. But baseball is better when people are stealing bases and run around. It was a lot of fun. So if you don't know, I'll educate you here. Whitey Herzog managed the Cardinals for a decade in the 80s. And, of course, he won the World Series in 82, 2 more National League pennants in 85 and 87. So sadly, Boyer would pass away. He wouldn't be able to see the Cards, the glory days in the 80s. He passed away in 1982 after a battle with cancer. 2 years later, his number 14 was retired by the Cardinals. He was also inducted into the inaugural class of the St. Louis Cardinals Hall of Fame in 2014. That leads me to my final brief section, the fame factor. Boyer's a player who really resounds with Cardinal fans of a certain generation, and if you grew up a Cardinals fan when Boyer was a star, I get it. To you, he's a Hall of Famer. It's kind of the same argument I made for Dale Murphy. I grew up with Dale Murphy in the 80s. He was the face of the franchise, especially through some bad years. To me, he's a Hall of Famer. If you didn't grow up in Atlanta in the 80s, 90s, you don't get it. You weren't there, and that's fine. I get that. That's fair. But I have to say, beyond Cardinals fans who grew up with Boyer, I just don't see the fame factor really there. In a very unscientific analysis, I'll just say Boyer played during an era when my dad was a kid. Like a lot of you guys, I got into baseball because my dad was a baseball fan. I grew up hearing stories. My dad would tell me about, the big players of his era, Mantle, Mays, Koufax, Aaron, Snyder, Drysdale. I didn't really hear any Ken Boyer stories. That's not to say he was bad, and maybe I just never asked. I didn't know as a kid. I remember asking my dad once about Boog Powell. He's not in the Hall of Fame. He was a one-time MVP. Maybe he has a similar career to Ken Boyer. And my dad said, "Oh yeah, I love Boog Powell." So anyway, he didn't necessarily volunteer Ken Boyer's name out there in the pantheon of greats of his childhood. It's a very unscientific process. I get it. Don't go out there and say, "Oh, this guy Russ, he bases his Hall of Fame vote on whether his dad told stories about a player." That's not necessarily true. I'm just saying that as an example of a fame factor. One thing I will say for a fame factor, I got to be careful here. Go Google it, but there's 3 stories that lead to other stories. But there was an interview with Norm Macdonald, the famous comedian, passed away on Howard Stern years ago. And he references a Ken Boyer, Don Drysdale story, and he says he can't talk about it. I'm not going to tell the story here, but if you go down a rabbit hole, there's a pretty incredible story involving Don Drysdale, Ken Ken Boyer, Bob Uecker, and Frank Sinatra, which I wish, basically everyone involved, well, except for Uecker, is passed away. Maybe Uecker doesn't want to tell the story because it implicates some people, but I'm like, wow, that was a story. I think if Uecker could tell that, or if Norm Macdonald been able to tell it, maybe it would have helped the fame factor a little bit. But it has nothing to do with anything. But go Google it. It's kind of an adult story, but it's pretty funny. If you go down a rabbit hole, you'll find it. Read it. We can talk about it on Twitter if you want to. But beyond that, look, I'll just say Ken Boyer, big popular player with Cardinals fans. I just don't see the fame factor really extending beyond that. And I'm not alone. He never received more than 5% of the Baseball Writers Ballot votes. He's appeared on 6 prior era committee ballots, and he's failed to earn induction. So, in my opinion, lightning round here. Boyer, great player, certainly a great Cardinal, and to me, not a Hall of Famer. Let's go with John Donaldson next. John Donaldson's a player for whom I knew very little about before seeing his name on the ballot. Now, I've read up on him a little bit, and let's go ahead and say, before we get into his life and stats, that not only do I think he's a surefire Hall of Famer, but in reading his life, it's clear that his call to the Hall is long overdue, in my opinion. I'll also say that his life and legacy are just so interesting, the backstory of his career is so complex, that I just don't have time to get into it today, so I'll hit the highlights and give you some resources so you can go do some of your own reading. Now, if you're anything like me, it's a good chance the first thing you did when you heard about John Donaldson or any other players, you go on Baseball Reference and you pull up their stats. This Hall of Fame discussion is largely statistical based, but it's interesting for Donaldson. If you did that, as I have recently, you probably noticed the same thing as me, and that's that he really doesn't have a lot of stats. He's listed as a center fielder and a pitcher. He has 5 years worth of batting statistics and only 2 seasons worth of pitching statistics. Now, these are, I believe, official Negro League statistics as of today, but they don't tell the whole story. So if you're wondering, hey, how's this guy that has 2 years of pitching stats and 5 years of batting, how is this guy a surefire Hall of Famer? Well, the resource I'm going to recommend you go to is a website. It's johndonaldson.bravehost.com. That's BRAVEHOST.com. Now, if you're looking at that thinking, this sounds, what is this, like GeoCities or something? Sounds like some website from 2002 or something. That's because it is a labor of love of 2 individuals, Peter Gordon and Sam Senke. In an interview with Gordon, he said he spent the past 20 years gathering information, stories, and stats of John Donaldson. It's become like his life cause. It's like Sean Connery in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, with his Holy Grail, journal. It's like this guy, Peter Gordon, this guy's just devoted his life to the cause of John Donaldson, just not only to get in the Hall of Fame, but just to get people to know about him, who he is, so we can spread, the stories of John Donaldson. And these guys have just done great work. And if you look at that website, vast contradiction to the official statistics that are on Baseball Reference. The statistics listed on that website are jaw-dropping. Let me just read them. Just if you're unaware, listen to this. Of the stats, and these guys have meticulously researched, the case of John Donaldson. He's listed at 400 as a pitcher, 428 verified wins, 5,295 strikeouts. He pitched 30 consecutive no-hit innings in 1915. He's credited with 14 no-hitters and 2 perfect games. And this is what I think is outstanding, especially in the era now of relief pitchers, middle relievers. 92% of his pitching appearances were complete games. It's unreal. Now, I won't hold you in suspense. If you're trying to reconcile these jaw-dropping stats with the sparse official, air quotes, stats in his Baseball Reference account, there's a tragic reason for this, and it's because many of these statistics that John Donaldson incurred were earned during barnstorming games, many of which occurred before Rube Foster formed the Negro National League in 1920. So as a result, Gordon even admits in an interview that, quote, Donaldson was dominating a lot of farmers, let's face it. He said, you have to remember, this is what segregation was. Segregation was push them out and get them out as far away as possible. And that meant some strange and out-of-the-way places where there weren't major leaguers. So Donaldson is pitching prior to the formation of the Negro Leagues, and he's pitching in the only way that he can. He can't pitch in the major leagues, unfortunately, because of the color barrier. It's awful. So this is the only way he can pitch, and he dominated. And this story is interesting to tie in with some of the other players on the ballot. We talked about this on my Louis Tiant episode Hall of Famer Monty Irvine said that Tiant Sr., Louis Tiant's father, he could have been a great Major League player if not for the color barrier. And one of the many tragedies of this color barrier is that players such as Tiant Sr., Josh Gibson, and in this case Josh Donaldson, didn't get a chance to pitch in the big leagues. In Donaldson's case, the Negro Leagues didn't even exist. He had no other recourse than pitching in these barnstorming games because he was pitching before 1920 before the league was formed. This is his only option. So you can critique this and say, yeah, these aren't official stats. These weren't even official stats in the Negro Leagues. He didn't have an option. But here's the thing, too. You don't have to take my word for it. Just like Louis Tiant Sr. had other people saying that he was commenting on his greatness, other players have commented on John Donaldson. In particular, if you know anything about baseball history, Buck O'Neil is just a legendary figure in baseball. Go watch Ken Burton's documentary about baseball. Buck O'Neil's in it. He's great. Hall of Fame. He's in the Hall of Fame now. Thank God. Finally got in a few years ago. It was an awesome day for baseball fans. Everybody was happy about it. I was super happy about it. Buck O'Neil said that Donaldson threw a slider 20 years before anybody else did, which is pretty incredible. I mean, that right there alone, we've talked about this in my Tommy John episode. Candy Cummings is in the Hall of Fame because he invented the curveball. A lot of people knock on it. They say, why is this guy in there? His stats weren't as good. Well, he invented the curveball. I mean, at some point, somebody had to make this stuff up. The game was invented in the 19th century, and even in the early 20th century, it was still, going a long way towards perfecting it and creating the modern game that we know today. So, this guy basically invented the slider, or maybe not invented, but was one of the few guys throwing it, years before anyone else did. I mean, that right there is a huge Hall of Fame case, just as a pioneer of the game, if anything, Here's the other thing, too, that really makes the case for me in terms of like a wow factor or fame factor or just a baseball history factor. It's incredible. Buck O'Neil also talks about how Donaldson was a mentor to the young Satchel Paige and taught Satchel not just how to pitch, but also the showmanship aspect of the game for which Paige was known. I won't get into it. Funny Satchel Paige showmanship story. Willie Mays talks about it when he was up in, I think it was rookie season in the Negro Leagues. He got out a double, I think, off Satchel Paige. Go read the story. It really tells it better than I do. But Satchel Paige basically just talked trash to him next to bat. It was like, I'm going to throw 3 strikes at you and you're going to sit down. And just proceeded, per Willie Mays' recollection, throw 3 of the nastiest pitches of his life he'd ever seen. And he said before the ball even left his hand, you could hear Satchel say, go sit down. And Willie whiffed and sat down. So Satchel had a showmanship. And, and that was part of his thing. And he's getting players' heads, and the crowd loved it. So all that stuff he learned from John Donaldson. And Gordon in an interview says this, I'll quote him here. It's kind of a long quote, but stick with me. He says, quote, there's these Satchel Paigeisms, right? Outfielders all sit down, walk the bases loaded, then strike out the next 3 guys. All these things that Satchel Paige was famed for doing, John Donaldson was doing 30 years before. He had to have that showmanship. He was entertaining people, but he was doing this in very remote places, so they weren't covered as much. Satchel Paige, had a roadmap for his whole thing. Of course, I'm outside of the quotes, this is my own opinion. The roadmap that Satchel Paige had was John Donaldson. So I just think this is fascinating that he's sort of the inspiration for Satchel Paige, not only in how he pitches, but also the showmanship aspect. What's really fascinating, too, is that as a result of Gordon's efforts, he actually came across some footage. Somebody had it like under their bed, been there like 70 years or something. There's actually footage of Donaldson pitching. I'll post a clip of it on my YouTube and on my Twitter and Blue Sky accounts. It's a YouTube link. If you watch it, it's pretty fascinating. It's just a fun video. It's really old. And according to Gordon, present-day scouts have looked at the footage and compared him to a left-handed Bob Gibson. I mean, that is just a nasty thought to think of a left-handed Bob Gibson, somebody that could throw like Gibson and was left-handed would dominate the league. And in fact, if you watch the video, I'm not an expert on pitching, but I do know Bob Gibson. I've watched videos of Gibson pitching. He's one of the best ever. And it does look like him, kind of the way he sort of leans down, hangs his hand over after he throws. I'm like, yeah, he does have a very similar delivery, but he's left-handed. So short lightning round, assessment of John Donaldson. If these stats are incredible, you could sit here and say, well, that wasn't, in the Negro Leagues, wasn't a Major League Baseball. It's not his fault. He wasn't allowed to play Major League Baseball. He played the only baseball that he was able to, and he thrived and he excelled, and he set the blueprint for some of the greatest players to ever play the game that followed him, including Satchel Paige, who's one of the greatest pitchers of all time, arguably the greatest pitcher of all time. So, without John Donaldson, arguably there's no Satchel Paige. So, just as a pioneer, you get him in there. But these stats, we look at 19th century stats and Negro League stats, and they're incorporating all these into baseball, official baseball statistics. And yeah, some of these stats are in barnstorming games, but that's all he could do. So it's fascinating. Look, there's so much more. There's so many more cool stories. I recommend you go to that website, check it out. In my mind, he's a Hall of Famer, and I think he should get in. So we'll get to my opinions as to who's going to get in, who should get in at the end. But I think he's a Hall of Famer. I think he should get in. All right, let's get into a good one here. Sorry, take a sip of water here. Steve Garvey. Wow, yeah, that's a good one. Steve Garvey is one of the many players, as I mentioned before, that inspired me to start this podcast, along with Dave Parker, Tommy John, Dale Murphy, Lou Whitaker, Fred McGriff, and Minnie Minoso are two of the players that inspired me. They got in before I got off my rear and started this podcast. I'm glad they're in now. But yeah, so Garvey's one of these guys that I used to just always look at and say, why is this guy not in the Hall of Fame? So if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering this too. There's a lot of people out there who played with him or grew up, cheering for him. And they say, a lot of people wonder, why is Steve Garvey not in the Hall of Fame? I don't want to get into it too much here. You can go read about it, but I would say he's someone whose Hall of Fame case initially suffered due to a lot of unsavory news reports about him that broke in the late 80s, early 90s. A few years before he first appeared on the ballot. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into it. There was some paternity lawsuits, a messy divorce. It's a period of time that Garvey himself has referred to as, quote, a midlife disaster. So I think, I'm not alone. A lot of people think, hey, when he first got on the ballot, everyone's kind of like, that guy's in the news, and everything I read is bad. So I think that hurt his chances. And when he first debuted on the ballot in 93, he got 41.6% of the vote. His voting totals peaked at 42.6 in 1995. But he was on the ballot 15 years and was never enshrined. And he was on 4 prior era committee ballots in 2011, 14, 18, and 2020. Interestingly, Tommy John was also on all those ballots. And Dave Parker and Louis Tiant are also on a few of them as well. So all those kinds of stories aside, I think time is a great healer of things. People are kind of forgotten. A lot of people that were covering that stuff at the time are retired. Younger generations may not care. But I think the biggest hurdle that he's facing now is that from the advanced statistics crowd. And I've got into this conversation with a lot of baseball fans, especially younger baseball fans that were kind of weaned on advanced statistics and Moneyball and WAR and this kind of stuff. And I get into the Garvey discussion, and they kind of laugh and they're like, are you kidding me, Steve Garvey? Because they look at his WAR. His career WAR is 38, which to a lot of people doesn't justify enshrinement. And again, if WAR is your magic bullet, your end-all be-all, I say 70 to 75 is that sweet spot. Yeah, he's not getting in on WAR. But this gets into a greater conversation, which I'm not going to necessarily get into now, about WAR. I don't see it as the silver bullet, the one ring to rule them all, the end-all be-all stat. I just don't think that's a good use of WAR. People are trying to quantify one stat to rule them all, to encompass everything. I see it as a good stat, and it is one stat among many. But I don't necessarily think the Hall of Fame discussion is just strictly based upon where someone stands on an all-time WAR leaderboard. Just like I don't think it stands based on their counting stats. It's a total package. Look at the advanced stats, counting stats, the hardware, the fame factors. A lot of factors that play into this. So a lot of people just look at WAR. I'm like, that's great. It is a factor. It's a big factor. But you got to look at other factors. So I think this, and I've mentioned this before, I think this is especially true for players who played before the advent of advanced statistics. Who didn't even know what WAR was, let alone that it would impact their chances of getting voted as MVP or to the All-Star game or get in the Hall of Fame. I talked about this a ton on my Dave Parker episode about him and other players at the time. They really focused on batting average because that's what they were tracked at. Everyone was always paying attention to the batting average. He said these players every day, they knew exactly what the batting average was. It's how they got their jobs, their starting positions. It's how they kept their starting positions. It's how they got paid. Another great book that talks about this is Aaron, autobiography of Hammer and Hank Aaron himself. Talks about batting average being the measuring stick of players getting playing time, getting paid. He also has some great stories. I won't say who he's talking about. You can go read it, but he talks about players that are great players, legends of the game and stuff that had good batting averages. And Hank Aaron kind of dogged on him a little bit. He talked about how this guy, be man on first and second, and so come up to bat, and or a guy in second or third, better analogies. And he said this guy easily could have hit a sac fly, drove in a run, but all he cared about was getting his little singles, getting his batting average up. So it was a funny story, and Hank Aaron's being critical to his teammates, but it just shows you guys were like cutthroat. They're like, yeah, I don't care about driving in the runs. I want to get batting average. That's how I keep my spot on the team. That's how I get paid. So that's how they were, graded. WAR, they didn't even know what WAR was. So there's a little bit of a issue here with grading players just on WAR, especially when you're grading players who didn't play in an era when they knew what the heck it was. So anyway, enough about philosophical differences and statistical player analysis. Let's look at Steve Garvey's career. What is it about Garvey that got him so close to getting in on a couple ballots and what makes him a perennial era committee ballot name? I'd hope to do a full episode on Garvey. I just don't have time. If he doesn't get in, I'll certainly do a full episode later with my typical in-depth biography. But for now, lightning round. I've talked enough. Let's get into the lightning round of Garvey's career. Steve Garvey played 19 years in Major League Baseball, all of them in sunny Southern California. His most famous tenure, of course, was his 14 seasons with LA Dodgers, but he also played 5 years for the Padres. Great rivalry. That playoff series this past postseason was awesome. Anyway, during that career, Garvey led the league in hits twice. And this is a big part of his Hall of Fame case. He had 6 seasons with over 200 hits. By the way, every player with 7 or more seasons of 200 hits, 200 or more hits, is in the Hall of Fame, with the exception of the 2 players tied for the most 200 hit seasons with 10 apiece. And that's Pete Rose and Ichiro, who's going to be enshrined this January. Come on. So just leaving Rose, of course, who passed away last year and would be in the Hall, but for his off-field gambling issues, but certainly one of the all-time greats. So if you look, in fact, the only players with 7 or more seasons of 200 or more hits is a pretty exclusive list of Inner Circle Hall of Famers and greats of the game. After Ichiro and Pete Rose, you got Ty Cobb with 9 seasons, 200 or more hits. Derek Jeter, Lou Gehrig, Paul Wainer, and Willie Keeler all had 8 seasons, 200 or more hits. Wade Boggs, Charlie Gehringer, and Rogers Hornsby all had 7. Of course, all those guys are in the Hall of Fame. Garvey's tied with several other players in baseball history with 6 seasons of 200 or more hits, including Stan Musial, one of the greatest ever. Bill Terry, Al Simmons, George Sisler, Sam Rice, Jesse Burkett, and Michael Young. Of course, all those players excepting Garvey and Young are also in the Hall of Fame. Before you say it or think it, I don't think the inclusion of Michael Young in this list diminishes or dilutes the impact of how elite 6 or more seasons of 200 hits is. Not to go off on a rabbit hole, but if you look at Young's career, I think he's someone who probably would have been in the Hall of Fame, but for the fact he only played 14 years. But he still had a really good career. He retired with a 300 batting average on the dot, 2,375 hits, over 1,000 runs in RBI, won a batting title in 2005, and was a 7-time All-Star. So certainly an outstanding player, but like Garvey, not in the Hall. Anyway, getting back to Garvey, the only other category he led the league in is perhaps one of his greatest arguments in favor of his Hall of Fame induction. And that's the 6 times he led the league in games played. If you weren't aware, Steve Garvey holds the National League record for consecutive games played with 1,207. He suited up and played every game for the Los Angeles Dodgers between September 3rd, 1975 and October 3rd, 1982. To me, that's a huge deal. We discussed consecutive games played streak on my Dale Murphy episode, and to me, not taking this into account in the Hall of Fame analysis of a player is just a textbook example of looking too much at stats on paper and not enough outside the 4 corners of a stat sheet and into the real world of baseball players. Anyone out there listening, and especially if you're in your 30s, 40s, older, I don't have to tell you, look, getting up and going to work every day is hard, no matter what your career is. But to do it in professional sports, where not only is your body taking on the stress of a 162 game season, just an absolute grind, but you're also dealing with, the inevitable nagging soreness, injuries, and not to mention jet lag, sleep deprivation of travel, playing day games after night games, etc. Just an absolute grind. And I got to hand it to players who show up every day ready to play. To me, that counts for something. And Hall of Fame voters, I think, should consider this for Garvey, just like they did for Cal Ripken, the Iron Man, who admittedly, Ripken had better stats, career stats, and he had a longer streak. But still, to me, holding the National League record for consecutive games played is huge. I think it's a major source of support for Garvey's Hall of Fame career. It's definitely one of those beyond the numbers aspects of his career that just can't be summarized neatly through WAR. I don't think WAR takes into account consecutive game streaks, and people that just scoff at his WAR and dismiss his case, it's like, to step out of your calculator and look at, how tough it is to play a whole season, let alone 1,207 consecutive games, National League record. So I would say, hey, take those 1,200 games consecutive played and shove them in your war pipe and smoke it. Anyway, I'm being joking. Let's look at counting stats. His WAR isn't very good. What are his counting stats? He's got very impressive counting stats. 1,143 runs, 2,599 hits, 440 doubles, 43 triples, 272 home runs, 1,308 RBI, 83 stolen bases. He's got a career slash line of 294, 329, and 446, with a 775 OPS and a 117 OPS plus. He retired with 3,941 total bases. So stats are very good, very respectable. But I think initially, in addition to some of the off-the-field chatter, the Hall of Fame voters noted his lack of hitting any major milestones, particularly 3,000 hits, which for a guy with 6 seasons of 200 or more hits in a 19-year career, I think it's a fair critique that he didn't hit 3,000 hits. In Garvey's defense, however, the 1981 season, right in the middle of his consecutive games played streak, was a strike-shortened season in which he missed 52 games. So finished 1 hit short of 2,600. He certainly would have gotten that hit and more, but for this strike. And frankly, even though it's like apples and oranges, just moves the needle a little bit, I think that changes the analysis a little bit. Just aesthetically, subjectively, for voters, if they look and say 2,600 or more hits, it's only a few hits, but on paper, I think it just looks more impressive. I think subjectively, especially back in the era when counting stats were, bigger deal than they are now, I think if he had gotten 2,600 or more, I think that might have moved the needle for him a little bit. If he got that and maybe didn't have the off-field issues, I think he might have gotten in, but he didn't, and that's why we're still talking about him. So his career 294 batting average is higher than Ballot mate Dave Parker, who batted 290 for his career. Although Parker pretty much led Garvey in every other statistical category. I'll post their comps online for you to view. And if you came down to Parker or Garvey, so you had to pick one, I'd pick Parker. That being said, I still think Garvey had a good career. Still think he had a Hall of Fame resume. Despite not being a real power hitter, that's another one that knocks on Garvey. He only, I have air quotes only, had 1 season with 30 or more home runs. But he also had 5 seasons with 100 or more RBI. And in his 19-year career, he had 6 seasons with a batting average higher than 300. I think it's big. He never struck out more than 100 times a season. Remember, this is back when high strikeout totals were looked down upon by players, by managers, by coaches, unless you hit a ton of home runs. And Garvey didn't hit a lot of home runs. Because this was before the modern, 3 true outcomes approach, which is another modern philosophy, which I think has created a negative perception of Garvey's career. His low strikeout totals, his good batting average, and his high hits aren't valued today as much as his WAR and home run totals. And the home run totals are looked down upon. And admittedly, 272 home runs for a first baseman, which is traditionally kind of a power position, was kind of a knock on him. So another modern lens by which Garvey is critiqued is, as we discussed, WAR, which is interesting considering that Garvey was a very good defensive first baseman. He led the league in putouts 6 times. In 5 of those seasons, he led all of Major League Baseball. Of course, no discussion of a player is complete without taking into account my favorite statistic, of course, fielding percentage. Got to get into it. Garvey led the league in fielding percentage 5 times, including a perfect 1,000 fielding percentage in 1984, a season in which he played 159 games at first base and had 0 errors. 0 errors. If you look at fielding stats, look, people want to knock on fielding stats, but they love to prop up WAR, which apparently takes into account their defense. I'm like, well, the stats are what they are. Guy played a whole season at first base, didn't get a single error. That's got to count for something. If you look at fielding stats, he also had several seasons in which he led the league in some advanced fielding statistics. I don't really get into those, don't have time now. I'll do a WAR episode, but again, today I think too often people use WAR as a poor substitute for fielding statistics. People knock on fielding stats, especially fielding percentage. In fact, I had some good-natured conversations on Blue Sky this past week with none other than Jay Jaffe himself about fielding percentage. And look, knock it all you want, but it's a stat. It's a real stat. And it's like, you can't just laugh and dismiss the fact that the guy played an entire season at first base and didn't make an error. So he was a good defender. And his good fielding was rewarded by 4 Gold Gloves. And the hardware is really a strong factor, maybe the strongest in Garvey's Hall of Fame case. Let's get in that real quick. Garvey's a 10-time All-Star. And as he pointed out in a recent interview with Dan Patrick, the National League won all 10 of the times he played on their team. And Garvey wasn't just along for the ride either. He had a hit in all but 2 of those All-Star games. And this is a big thing. Twice he was named the All-Star Game MVP in 1974 and 1978. To me, this is another key part of Garvey's Hall of Fame case. He played his best when the stage was the biggest. In addition to excelling in the All-Star Game, Garvey was also a 2-time NLCS MVP, winning in 1978 and 1984. And although he was not the MVP in the series, he was part of the Dodgers' 1981 World Series championship team. And in that 1981 World Series, he batted .417 with 10 hits and 3 runs. To me, this is all a huge part of Steve Garvey's Hall of Fame case. As you know, I like to put a lot of stock on how well a player does in the postseason. There's a lot of metaphors I like to use. Cream rises at the top, lights shine brightest on the biggest stage, Hall of Famers do Hall of Fame things. However you want to describe it, baseball is a 162-game regular season grind, all to get to a very narrow sample size of games for all the glory, all the legend, for all time. And the players who stand out and excel in the postseason, especially on a consistent basis, to me, have a leg up on the Hall of Fame case than players who play poorly in the postseason. That's just my position. I'm not going to budge for that. And if you think I'm wrong, look at this past World Series. You had how many potential future Hall of Famers in this World Series? Judge, Soto, Mookie, Ohtani, Freddie, Garrett Cole. There's probably more. Who excelled? Freddie. And he's hurt, and echoes of Kirk Gibson and all this stuff. It's like, the fact that Freddie had these consecutive home runs game streak, the walk-off, grand slam, all this stuff. On the hurt foot, it's like, man, that guy cemented his legend, cemented his Hall of Fame case, I think. To me, it's like, that's a no-doubt Hall of Famer right there. I feel the same way about Garvey. He didn't have the dramatic walk-off, grand slam or like that, but like 2-time NLCS MVP, hit .417 with 10 hits in a World Series winning team. The guy was clutch in the offseason. And you don't have to take my word for it. Look at the stats. In his career in the postseason, he played 55 games. He had a .338 batting average with 11 home runs, 32 runs, 31 RBI, 8 doubles, 3 triples, and a .910 OPS. He had 122 total bases and 222 at-bats. That is fantastic. And to me, that's the mark of a Hall of Famer. Finally, the cap on the feather of Steve Garvey's career, of course, was the 1974 National League Most Valuable Player Award. That year, he hit .312 with 200 hits, 21 home runs, and 111 RBI for the first-place Dodgers, who had 102 wins that season but ultimately lost the A's in the World Series. Now, if hardware is your thing, a big consideration for Hall of Fame votes, take this into account. The 10 or more All-Star appearances, puts him in pretty rare, company, and he's got the MVP. So I just think all of that together really boosts his Hall of Fame case. So you pair all this, the All-Stars, the MVP award, the 2 All-Star MVPs, the 2 NLCS MVPs, his World Series trophy, the National League record for consecutive games played, 6 seasons of 200 or more hits, 2,599 career hits, and the 294 career average. To me, all that put together makes for a very compelling Hall of Fame case. And to me, in my opinion, Steve Garvey's a Hall of Famer. You want to debate me on it? You want to talk about war? Find me on Blue Sky. Find me on Twitter. Let's talk about it. All right. Sorry, I gotta take sips of water. We're doing this live, guys. Doing this live. Vic Harris. Let's talk about Vic Harris. Vic Harris is a player I admittedly knew nothing about before I saw his name on the ballot. And I'm glad he's on the ballot because the more I read about him, the more I realize what a great player he was and what a huge impact he's had on the game of baseball. I should say foremost that if you start Googling Vic Harris, you'll find there's 2 Vic Harrises. One played between 1972 and 1980 for the Rangers, Cubs, Cardinals, Giants, and Brewers. Finished his career with a .217 batting average and a negative 6.3 WAR. This is not the Vic Harris we're talking about. Vic Harris on the ballot was born in 1905 and played in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And as an African-American man, he was barred from playing in the big leagues due to the color barrier. So his career was in the old Negro leagues. Known as Vicious Vic, there's very little online about him. In fact, MLB's website has biographies for many of the other Negro League players, but doesn't have one for Vic. I couldn't find a Sabre biography either for Vic Harris, which is a shame, because from what I've read, he was a fantastic player and very deserving of consideration for Cooperstown. Luckily, though, unlike Donaldson, because Harris played after the formation of the Negro Leagues, we are able to account for most of his career statistics, with the unfortunate caveat, of course, that records of this league are oftentimes incomplete, which is another tragedy of the way things were back then. If you pull up his stats on Baseball Reference, you'll see that in a 17-year career, the left-hitting and right-throwing outfielder retired with a .303 batting average. 428 on base percentage, a 798 slugging percentage, and a 798 OPS. His OPS plus was 112, and at various points in his career, he led the league in runs, triples, and doubles. Now, if you know anything about the old Negro Leagues, you know that their seasons were shorter. So as a result, players from that era, they didn't amass a lot of the counting stats. It's not their fault. I'm sure they would love to play 162 games if they just played shorter seasons. So the counting stats, you can't compare them. So he finished his career with 738 hits, 31 home runs, 391 RBI, but the averages were very strong. The slash line, the OPS plus, very strong. And I realize it's a bit of a slippery slope, and there's some speculation, estimation involved. But if you spread out his stats over a 162-game average, they are pretty dang impressive. His 162-game average would be 121 runs, 185 hits, 29 doubles, 12 triples, 8 home runs, 98 RBI, and then that same slash line, 303, 370, and 428. So with Vic and other players from this era, again, you can't hold their counting stats against them because they didn't get a chance to play in the major leagues due to the color barrier, which is an absolute shame. But if you take Vic's talent, his numbers, his averages, and you played him today, you look at that 162-game average, it's a good chance you're looking at somebody, if they played 10, 15 years, they're going to amass a Hall of Fame career. But all those projections and speculations aside, let's take a look at his actual stats and accomplishments. In addition to the outstanding 303 career batting average, Vic was a 7-time All-Star and was a 3-time World Series champion in 1943, 44, and 48. But it was after his playing career that maybe gives him the best argument for induction in the Hall of Fame. And that's when he became a manager of the legendary Homestead Grays. And he amassed a managerial record of 547 wins and 278 losses for a .663 winning percentage, which is the second highest managerial winning percentage in history and the highest among managers with 400 games or more. Bullet Rogan has the highest managerial winning percentage at .698 in 369 games. And an interesting footnote of his career, his last baseball job would be in 1950 with the Birmingham Black Barons, a legendary team that played at Rickwood Field in Birmingham, which, as you recall, hosted its first Major League Baseball game this past season, just days after former Birmingham Black Barons star Willie Mays passed away. If you watched that game, it was awesome. It was a celebration of the Negro Leagues. Rickwood Field is a beautiful stadium. Talking to my dad earlier, there's a book out there by Alan Barra, great book about Rickwood Field. My dad gave it to me as a birthday present years ago, and my dad has now passed away, so it's a special book to me because he grew up in northern Alabama and used to go down and see games at Rickwood Field, had a lot of great stories. I think he said, too, in Little League, like they would have championship games and stuff there, too. They talk about it in the book, so he may have played there. I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, a lot of sentimental attachment to Rickwood Field, so that was really cool. So that ties Vic Harris in with the sort of the legacy and the history of Rickwood and the Birmingham Black Barons and Negro Leagues. That was really cool. He had his last job there. And looking at his resume, it looks to me like Vic Harris clearly has a great Cooperstown resume. It's certainly worthy of enshrinement. Whether he gets in on this ballot, however, remains to be seen. And that's a good segue into our next portion here. I want to talk about the strategy of the ballot, my predictions, my wish list, and if you will, and who I want to get elected on the ballot. So let's take a look at this real quick. Take a sip of water here. We're doing this live, guys. All right, let's get into the logistics here. The voting members of the Classic Era ballot have been chosen. There's 16 voters. Each voter can pick up to 3 candidates on the ballot. Any candidate who receives a vote from at least 12 of the 16 committee members, which means 75%, would earn induction. Now, the 16 people who are voting, it's Hall of Fame players Paul Molitor, Eddie Murray, Tony Perez, Lee Smith, and Ozzie Smith, along with Hall of Fame manager and former player Joe Torre. There's also baseball executives Sandy Alderson, Terry McGurk, Dayton Moore, Art Marino, and Brian Sabian, plus journalists and historians Bob Elliott, Leslie Heafy, Steve Hurt, Dick Cagle, and Larry Lester. Now, this is where it gets tough. I really think not only did every player here have a good career, they all have a good Hall of Fame case. But it's a numbers game. And trying to figure out, read the tea leaves here as who you think is going to get in. It reminds me of a little poker saying, you don't play the game, you play the man. You got to look at who's voting and, it's still an impossible task, but I'm going to try anyway. In this instance, let's briefly look at some of these voters to see if there's any reason to believe they'll favor any one player, because let's face it, historically, it's not uncommon for players and managers to vote for their teammates or friends, players head coach. That's fine. I'm not going to knock them for that. It's just human nature. I'd probably do the same thing. If it was my teammate for a long time or somebody I coach, I'd probably vote for him. So, that's just human nature. One of the things that stands out for me right off the bat is the inclusion of Paul Molitor. As I mentioned on my Tommy John episode, Molitor is one of 2 Hall of Famers to have undergone Tommy John surgery, along with John Smoltz. I can't help but think that's going to be on Molitor's mind as he votes. I have to imagine he'll vote for Tommy John. He kind of has to. He wouldn't have a career. He wouldn't be in the Hall of Fame for Tommy John. So, anyway, we'll see. That's interesting. Speaking of Tommy John, Joe Torre managed the Mets in the late 70s and early 80s. At the same time that John was having a late career renaissance at the Yankees. So, not sure how much that is going to impact Torre's voting. And I think that Torre is the big key here because he, in his playing career, his managerial career, he saw all these guys. He also played for the Cardinals, so there's a good, he may have a soft spot for Boyer, I don't know. But I think his opinion is going to carry just a ton of weight, considering he's a legendary baseball figure, he's a Hall of Famer, he's 84 years old, had a great playing career, Hall of Fame managerial career. More importantly, his playing career, his managing career spanned the careers of everyone on this ballot, except for Harris and Donaldson. So again, he saw all these guys play. And I really think that Torre is going to be the key here and may kind of run the room. It's interesting also to note if we're trying to predict. I mean, I don't know how Torre is going to predict because he's been around so long. He's seen everyone play. Very knowledgeable baseball guy, very respected. It's worth noting, as a player, Torre won the MVP in 1971, and then Dick Allen won the MVP in 1972. So, as a contemporary Dick Allen, I don't know. Maybe he votes for Dick Allen. Who knows? I don't know how he's going to vote, but I just know that whatever he picks, I have to imagine he's going to carry a lot of weight in that room. So let's look at Tony Perez. Tony Perez played against Louis Tiant, especially in that key 1975 World Series. Plus, Perez got traded to Boston just after Tiant left, and no doubt had heard stories about Tiant. So Perez was also interviewed and featured prominently in the documentary A Long Way From Home, The Untold Story of Baseball's Desegregation, which I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, and which discusses Dick Allen and Louis Tiant. So if I were, betting man, I'd say Perez is probably going to vote for Tiant and Allen. He's also teammates with Dave Parker at the end of his career in Cincinnati. So if I had to guess, I'd say he votes for Tiant, Allen, and Parker. That's just my guess. I could be wrong. Now let's look at some of these executives. I don't know a lot about them. I took sort of a shallow dive here to just kind of understand what organizations they've been a part of, see if that might give us any guidance on maybe where we think they're going to vote. Sandy Alderson was involved with the A's, Padres, Mets, and very important, he was part of the 1989 World Series champion A's that had Dave Parker on him. So maybe that means Sandy votes for Dave, I don't know. Terry McGurk was involved with the Braves. I'm not sure how Terry's going to vote. Wild card to me, not sure. Same with Dayton Moore, who was involved with the Rangers, Braves, and Royals. Not sure how that's going to impact his vote. This is interesting. Artie Moreno, he's owner of the Angels. He's been involved in baseball a long time. He's the first Mexican-American owner of a major sports team in the U.S., One thing that's interesting is a fellow Southern California guy, and he's also been involved in Republican politics. And Steve Garvey, of course, ran for Senate as a Republican this past election. So I got to imagine that him and Steve Garvey are probably close. I could see Artie, voting for Steve Garvey just because they're both Southern California guys, both involved, run the same political circles. But, I don't know. Could be guessing. We also got Brian Sabian. He's been involved with the Giants and Yankees. Born in New England guys. So maybe votes for Louis Tiant. I don't know. Could be guessing here. Pardon me, I'm drinking some water here. Let's look at the media members and historians. We got Bob Elliott, Canadian sports writer, covered the Blue Jays. I'm not really sure how he's going to vote. Maybe he has fond memories of Dave Parker hitting that double in the division clinching game. I'm hoping, I really want Dave Parker to get in. Leslie Heafley, this is really interesting. She's on the SABR board of directors. She's written and published a lot about the Negro Leagues and women in baseball. It's really interesting. She's authored SABR biographies of Billy Wagner. I have my Billy Wagner episode. He's on the Baseball Writers Ballot. And Negro Leagues owner Ethel Posey. She loves the Mets and writes about them. Not sure that's going to impact us here. I would guess that given her academic background, the fact she's written about the Negro Leagues, she might be stumping for Donaldson and Harris, two guys there on the ballot. So that's just my prediction. I could be wrong. Steve Hurt, he's from New York, and he's described as, quote, the country's foremost expert on sports statistics. I have no telling how he's going to vote. It depends on if he likes analytics or the counting stats. I'm curious what his position is going to be on Donaldson, where a lot of these stats are, meticulously compiled from newspapers, but they're in barnstorming games. That's an interesting case. I don't know what's going to vote. So, Dick Hankel is a journalist who's covered the Royals and Cardinals. Maybe this bodes well for Boyer and Dick Allen. I remember played a season with the Cardinals. Had a good season with the Cardinals. Finally, we've got Larry Lester. He's an author, historical statistician, and his area of expertise is the Negro League. So, good chance he's probably voting for Harris and Donaldson too. So. It's my very brief and short analysis of the voters, and it doesn't really help, sorry. It's interesting that I think there's two voters who have academic backgrounds and are experts in Negro Leagues, as you got Harris and Donaldson on the ballot. I think at least one of them is going to get in this year, if not both of them. But if I had to guess, I'd say Donaldson first, just due to the impact he had on the game, his role as a barnstorming legend prior to creation of Negro Leagues, and his impact on Satchel Paige. He's just a figure that has impacted the game of baseball in a manner far beyond what statistics can quantify. That being said, here's the thing. Joe Torre's on there. Joe Torre had a long career as a player, good player, then a Hall of Fame managerial career. I think that Torre might have a soft spot for Vic Harris. It's tough to say. And Torre also, played on the Cardinals. Boyer played in the Cardinals. We got one Cardinals reporter. Maybe we get a little bit of love for Boyer. I don't know. But Torre, I think he's going to be the key. But otherwise, a lot of the players that are on this ballot, their careers or their early lives, overlap with Allen, Garvey, John, Parker, and Tiant. So I have to imagine they might have a little bit more of an idea of what they're bringing to the table as opposed to Vic Harris and Donaldson. So anyway, apart from my attempts here to try to discern possible motives or pre-voting favoritism, it's really tough to predict what's going to happen. So I'll just kind of say what I would like to happen. I'll just go ahead and say what I think is that everyone on the ballot, with the exception of Boyer, would get my vote for the Hall of Fame. I wouldn't vote for Boyer for the Hall of Fame. At some point or the other, I would vote for all the other guys to get in Cooperstown. But, we can only pick a few. So in this case, in a vacuum, not taking into account any other considerations, if I had to rank my votes from 1 to 8, with the first 3 getting in the Hall of Fame, I would rank them Dave Parker, Dick Allen, John Donaldson, Tommy John, Steve Garvey, Vic Harris, Louis Tiant, and Ken Boyer. So again, all other things being equal in a vacuum, my 3 I would pick would be Parker, Allen, and Donaldson. With the one caveat that will harken back to my comments earlier at the beginning of the episode. Now, let's get into a little discussion we've been having on the Twitter sphere and on Blue Sky. I do agree with a lot of the fans out there who said there should be a push to prioritize enshrining living players. As a baseball fan, too often we've seen players pass away before getting enshrined. And even Louis Tiant said, almost kind of sarcastically, flippantly, hey, if you don't vote me in during my lifetime, just don't vote me in at all. So even the players are upset. If you're going to get in, they want to get in while they're alive. And if you look at my list through that lens, we're not in a vacuum. We're in the real world. I would still keep Parker at number 1. He's a sentimental favorite. I think he's got the stats. And look, he's also 73 years old and suffering from some Parkinson's disease. And honestly, not to get emotional, it would break my heart if he does not get in tomorrow. Honestly, I hate to say that, but we're human beings. It's not just stats on paper. These are people. I'm Dave Parker's number 1. He's 73. He's got Parkinson's. I want to see him get in. It breaks my heart also, too, getting a little emotional thinking about that Dick Allen didn't get in during his lifetime. And he passed away in 2020, just never having seen Cooperstown. I think Dick Allen will eventually get in. I don't know about this year, but he's going to get in. I think eventually he will get in. It just breaks my heart that he's going to get in after he passed away. All this stuff being said, I want to put this caveat out there because I'll say this. Look, Tommy John is still alive. He's 81 years old. And as I said on my Tommy John episode, I do think his 288 wins plus the surgery that bears his name makes him an essential part of baseball history and someone who deserves enshrinement in the Hall of Fame. And I would be willing, would I a voter, to leapfrog him onto number 2 on my list so he can get in while he's alive. As to Donaldson at my number 3, I think I'd keep him. It's funny, Donaldson has to either be number 1 or number 8 on your list. Either he's 110% a Hall of Famer or 110% not a Hall of Famer. There's no middle ground. And really the only reason you would say he doesn't deserve enshrinement is because he was pitching in exhibition games and barnstorming events. He wasn't pitching against major leaguers or even, other Negro leaguers. He was pitching admittedly by his main biography against farmers and whatnot. So some of his statistics can be, were maybe inflated a little bit. But of course, the obvious retort to that is these were the only games he could play in due to segregation and societal factors. And Donaldson did his best to win with what he could. And he impacted future generations of players, including a direct influence on the great Satchel Paige. So he did eventually play in the Negro Leagues and after it was formed. And, with 2 historians of that league on the ballot, I think he's going to get in. It's one of those. Him and John, I think, really have the biggest can you tell a story of baseball without these guys. I think that Donaldson and Tommy John have the biggest you can't tell the story of baseball without these guys factors to their cases. Let's say that. So I'll edit my list to say that, taking into account this desire to enshrine living players, my final answer, if I were voting this time around, I'd be voting for Dave Parker, John Donaldson, and Tommy John. Sorry, Steve Garvey. I think you belong, but I also think you're going to get in. And Tommy John's, he's older than you, so I'd pick him first. As to what I think would happen, I get people actually sending me messages and stuff asking me, who do I think is going to get in? I think Dave Parker is going to get in tomorrow. That's the one thing I know for sure. I think Dave Parker is going to get in tomorrow. Although I see Louis Tiant as someone who's kind of borderline. He just passed away. He's been in the news. He's been, he's on the forefront. People are re-examining his career and his life. So if he's ever going to get in, he's either going to get in tomorrow, or I think he might never get in at all. I don't think Boyer's going to get in tomorrow. I don't think Garvey's going to get in tomorrow, although he has a lot of contemporary players on there. And he's got Art Marino, I think is kind of fellow political buddy, Southern California guy. I don't know. I don't know if Garvey's going to get in tomorrow. I think that of Donaldson and Vic Harris, I would say Donaldson probably should get in first. But with Torrey being the player manager, I honestly think that Vic Harris, especially if Torrey starts stumping for Harris and sort of runs the room, I could see Vic Harris, because he's a player manager along with Torrey, getting the vote over Donaldson. So he might get in. I don't know if John Donaldson gets in tomorrow. I'm stumping for him, and I know his, Gordon's stumping for him. I don't know if he gets in. I think Dick Allen has the same sort of sentimental pull that Louis Tiant has because he recently passed. But if it just depends on whether the player, if they want to prioritize living players, they're going to go with Parker, they're going to go with Tommy John, and they're going to go with Steve Garvey. And I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. But honestly, I think only 1, 2 at the most of these guys are going to get in. It's Dave Parker. If I really had to pick, I think it's going to be Dave Parker and Vic Harris. And I think Harris is going to get the pick over Donaldson because Torrey is a player manager. So that's who I think is going to get in, is Parker and Harris. I could be wrong, though. If I were voting, like I said, it'd be Parker, be Tommy John, and John Donaldson. But I'm not voting. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. Stay tuned. My next episode, hopefully get my computer in by then. I'll have a better sound. And we're going to break down what happened on the ballot. So until then, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and watch a baseball game.